Thank you. All right. Good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the introduction. And a very big thank you, actually, to Bunchepe for finding me my introduction. Because I've been struggling with a number of these thoughts recently, but I realized that it was that Adorno quote. That Adorno quote was just perfect. Because I realized that one of the things that we're struggling with in the field of architecture, design, art, possibly even music, dance, performing arts, is that we are still marked, tattooed, branded by the modernist notion that these fields need to have a function, some kind of function. And all of a sudden I realized what it was that I couldn't figure out in this talk. This has no function. Adorno is absolutely right. But it does have a role in society. And this is where we keep making our intellectual mistake. We're looking at how design can change society, but we're supposed to be seeing how design relates to society, how society relates to design, how we work together in the environment of, well, Latour's using it these days, the Anthropocene. The era in which our environment is determined, formed by us as humans. We don't have our struggle anymore between the natural and the artificial. It's all artificial, or all natural, depending on which perspective you want to take. And this, in fact, is the fundamental issue. What is our role? Can we change society? Of course we can change society. Should we change society? That might be more important. And it is along those lines of the role of architecture and design that I'd like to take you on a hopefully enlightening but perhaps confusing, to take Mr. Geiß's first comments, I don't know, a little trajectory along a long history and a microhistory. And I think between the two, there is an illumination in one of the fundamental changes that has happened in the last 5 years. So point one, the Venice Biennale last year, curated by Rem Koolhaas. We all know who Koolhaas is, we all know his beautiful provocations, but what struck me is this one particular wall. The whole Biennale itself, a full spectrum of questions facing architecture, but this wall was photographs of the Lawrenciana Library, photographs made by Koolhaas's daughter, Charlie, and the one thing that everyone walked on, because it was printed on the floor and apparently didn't notice so much, was his own reminiscence of being confronted with the Lawrenciana Library for the first time. And this was after he had completed his studies. And his own reminiscence basically concluded, I learned a lot of rules, but the rules tell me nothing of how to actually make something that has the impact of this library. So for him, it was a confrontation, in a way, the contrast between the rules we learn and the reality we face. But it is beyond that, I think, because he was also confronted with this old piece, the timeless value of architecture that can still strike one, whether you visit it in 1970, 1992, 2004, it is there. It does something. It strikes a chord. It does something. Is that a function? Or is that the role that architecture has, to strike a chord, to make us stand still for a minute, to question our own presuppositions? Now, this wall strikingly actually made me stop, because it made me realize that one of the things that we're struggling with is the big narratives. Now, Lyotard went through this years ago and said, this grand narrative, it's dead. We know that, but we're still marked by it. We can't get rid of it. The questions that we see in looking at the details of a library like this are questions that remind us what architecture is trying to do. And that starts way before. Because, there was a point where somehow, after the Renaissance, we started to think about what architecture could do beyond facilitating the elite, beyond serving the norms and habits of society. We started to think that perhaps we could transform a societal gathering by offering them new modes of living. We thought perhaps, obvious solutions. Can design change society? Yes, we've got smoggy, smoky cities. And if we design those differently, then perhaps we could live and work in the sun. There are far better YouTube films on things like, Charlie biking along the Garden City, which I will leave to you all to find yourself. But these diagrams show very clearly what the problems were that the modernists were facing and why we turned to such a grand scheme. And in a way, even after the Club of Rome, we should be thankful, because had we not had our modernist planning, perhaps we would all still be living, 17 families to a very small, cramped Victorian home. So there's something to be said for the plan voisin. But then come the next steps. As we rationalize, we kind of move along, we get it a little bit more into filing cabinets. We worry a little more about sunlight, and we worry a little less about the urban fabric. And right after that came the critiques. We had perfectly nice cities. Why are we mowing them down and putting up all those blocks? Why, when we've got perfectly acceptable, comfortable, small dwellings, do we start building these blocks and adding things that require these endless fields of cars? You'll notice I've been taking you through from about 1850. We are now, by this bottom slide, in 1957 in New York. And of course, the obvious 1968 grand attack on everything that architecture's demand of modernist planning stood for. We needed to pull up those paving stones. We needed to get back the personal agency. And then we got a little stuck. I'm going to spare you all the slides of the beautiful bubblegum houses and pop culture dreams that we knew that were going to be realized after the 60s. Because the 60s were great. But then it was 1973, and there was an oil crisis. And this is my micro-history that I want to put to you today. Because we are now in a time of economic crisis. We are in a time of conceptual crisis for the discipline. And the last mega crisis there was for architecture was in the 1970s. In the United States, after the oil crisis, all social housing funds dried up. There was simply no more money to provide. And all of a sudden, architects found themselves unemployed, unwanted, unnecessary, and very much unloved. Now, at this point, I think, is what the turning point came that led us to today. Because, as you can see, we've been looking for legitimacy, and the Bauhaus gave us legitimacy. We were to design the whole world in a manner that the masses would live better. But then, 1973, unloved and unemployed. Now, at this time, there was a new mode of thinking. Excuse me. At this time, as we kind of moved out of the saving of the world and started moving into the introspection of what our profession actually had to offer, there was a very wise man, a sociologist, Robert Gutmann, who came up with the term the entrepreneurial profession for architecture. And his argument went something like this. There had been a small academic debate that is by now probably long gone in most people's memory, but in about 1972, the scholar Nathan Glaser had put architecture in the group of what they called the minor professions. Not very academic, not very intellectual, trying hard to be scientifically valid, but the tenor of the story was nice that they play along too. Coming along from this, Gutmann proposed that perhaps it should be seen a little differently. Architecture was actually in a very fundamental struggle for legitimacy. Architects themselves like to place themselves on the same level as doctors and lawyers. Mind you, this is America, so this is an American discourse. It was a little bit different here on the continent, but lawyers, doctors, architects. Only all of a sudden Gutman realized and wrote down that the actual critical need for the services of an architect are not quite the same as the critical need for legal and medical services. Little different. And it is at this point that he actually proposes to the architecture field in the biggest American magazine, Progressive Architecture, to think of themselves as an entrepreneurial profession. They actually need to go out and create the desire for someone to hire them. We are not in modernist land anymore. You have to go out and get them. And that exactly is where we are today. Because we have gone out and we have done that. We have created dream worlds. Rem Koolhaas among the first of them. He dug up this old little cartoon from Life magazine that showed how the skyscraper was actually this endless stack of utopias. You could build a new identity for yourself on every level. He proposed the city of the captive globe, where there was just this kind of endless metropolitan hum of different projects, and all the avant-gardes are actually encapsulated in this. But what it is about is the dream image. It's about the advertising world. It's about gaining desire. It's about drawing people in. And that worked for a really long time. That worked very well, in fact. The 1990s was marked by the cheeriness, the enthusiasm, the conviction that this kind of dream world, that the architect had something to offer. It rolled us right out into the 1990s of the creative class. Richard Florida gave us our next sense of actual legitimacy. Architects since Bilbao were able to make whole cities affluent, not just buildings. And I think, to me, when the question was put, can design change society? These are the thoughts that came at the front of it. Because that last time, the 1970s, the 1980s, there was still that conviction. It can change society. Only now, this is a slide that Rem Koolhaas himself has been using in recent lectures to question, what has it brought us? Good question. So if design can change society, if design should change society, then the next big question is indeed, how? Because this one, to me, now is at a dead end. It worked for a long time. It gave a spectacular amount of credibility and legitimacy to the profession itself. But now that the money's dried up, and now that we see our resources are dwindling, and now that we see that every apartment building we put up in China that is no longer sold is creating a new bubble that can create a new crisis, there's a whole new question that architecture needs to put. And this is where the double role begins to come in. Design might change society, but how should society change design? Well, those answers started coming early in the 90s as well. Slowly, but steadily. We had the first load of do-it-yourself projects in the Netherlands. This is about the mid-90s. In the midst of many developer tracts, there were a few firms that kind of went to the 1970s punk do-it-yourself era and started to look around if they could get more participatory projects. Germany itself, and Berlin, more than any, is famous for its Baugruppen, that at this point are gaining more traction than we would have expected 20 years ago. Are we moving towards the schemes that we can see in the exhibition outside? I think certainly. I think something like this should stand as critique of normal architectural production. I think the new modes of urban farming can definitely stand as a new mode of dream production. Do we want our cities to be concrete blocks, or do we want them to be green oases that can actually feed the people inside? Within this, however, there are many different trajectories, and I think a forum like this is very worthwhile to understand what the architect is doing, what the designer is doing, why, and especially to share insights in different modes. I was very, very pleased to hear the first two talks, as I think we started with very hardcore modernist principles of the avant-garde and an insight into the history that kind of got us here, and we're still all kind of looking for answers forward. And the answers forward are not clear. And I think that to me is why perhaps I started my talk with the title Embracing Humility. If there is one thing that the modernists did not do, they were not humble. They were pretty certain of what they were doing. And if there's one thing that I think marks new projects, it is the humility of realizing that even as we have technology that goes radically forward, we never know where that will end. The projects are small. They take on utopian elements, but they try not to extend it to the world over. And in the meantime, they are also introspective. To return to the Biennale, for example, Koolhaas proposed a very simple division. We didn't really need to look at architecture anymore. We needed to look at the elements. The elements in themselves were perhaps enough intellectual baggage at this point to be studying. I'm going to skip over what has been omitted and what has been included. However, because we are at the project Bauhaus, I also want to turn back a little and propose that maybe this very simple curriculum is perhaps something that these contemporary element seekers are looking for. The idea that maybe it is not so much anymore about finding permanent utopias and grand projects, but engaging with the things themselves, learning to work with stone, learning to work with wood, learning to work with the plastics that go into 3D printers, learning perhaps to 3D print food, as I recently saw. And what that also means, which we keep forgetting in all of our hope to gain economic value, is that it also means learning to deal with ourselves again. The Bauhaus used to start with morning exercises. Now, I'm not sure that, we're all ready to get up and do some serious yoga now, but learning to demarcate what it is that we want and what it is that the things themselves ask of us is perhaps one of the trajectories forward as well. What one sees as we begin to loosen from our economic grip. We've been an entrepreneurial profession. We have built the world over. We have used up all the resources. So what do we do now? And that is how design can change society. We could take the lead in looking back to value. Because all of our objects, all of our buildings, all of our chairs, tables, doorknobs have implicit values. Our societies steer them, and we steer the societies. We have arguments now in Rotterdam about mosques and whether they should remain dual entries for men and women, or whether those should be applied together. I mean, these are fundamental questions. And these are not questions of economy. These are questions of what we believe. These are questions of shared values, individual values, of trajectories within how we live our lives. And over the course of the 20th century, design has taken a very prominent and very strong position in the political implications, and perhaps now a slightly more humble approach in which we see that the things we can do have an effect, but where we perhaps also listen to the needs that there are. Some of the new design thinkers are calling this nudge, encouraging appropriate behavior rather than pushing it. And I think there are things to be seen out there that show that a younger generation, all in its own different ways, and I have a very small selection here of a few things that struck me, but they're things that show an attempt to engage with the world in a non-economic and non-utilitarian fashion, from the premises of form giving, of aesthetics, and of values. There was a design exhibition in the Boijmans van Beuningen Museum in Rotterdam where they literally celebrated craftsmanship, especially the handmade. But the handmade, even though the sign says that like that, the handmade is blended. It is an Anthropocene engagement. We use computers, we use 3D printers, and we modify them by hand, or we use our hands and we modify those by the digital. About 10 years ago, when the phone booths in New York started being absolutely disused because of cell phones, one of the unemployed architects just went around and started installing bookshelves. But he didn't only install them, he offered the drawing of how to make them so that everyone can install their own bookshelves. This too goes beyond economics, perhaps goes to functionality, but it goes beyond economics. It goes to the spaces we are in, the way that we use our objects, the spaces that are left after our habits have changed. This is not actual design, but it does show the innovation of someone who is struggling with an impossible problem and how to fix that. That's what design can do. That's what society can make design do. I don't think it's so much about the position of the architect anymore. It's about I hate to say it, but the design thinking, the approach to it. It is the way that a designer looks at this. You know, one of these typical urgent graffiti moments in England. And then if your name is Banksy, you change that into a much more charming picture. Now, if we have to ask what design can do to change society, I think it's much about what design should do. And it is also very much about understanding that there is only so much we can do, but that only so much can make the difference between no future or a sweet little moment. Thank you.